We have two speakers here who'll be engaging with the theme of memory and multiculturalism and drawing together many of the themes that we've been discussing over the course of the day when we're thinking about how the past is represented, how it shapes the present, and whose past it is, and who is this we that we are talking about. So the colleagues that are here to talk about these issues are Hana Whitaker and Varun Uberoi, both from social and political sciences, but Hana is a historian with research interests in the history of modern Africa. She's worked on borders, she's worked on development, she's worked on conflict, and more recently she's been working on the ways in which the British Empire is commemorated and some of the issues and sensitivities around that. And Varun Uberoi is a political theorist in social and political sciences, and he works on multiculturalism in different national contexts from the perspective of political theory and considering how multiculturalism has been theorized, but also in terms of political policy and public policy, and so how policymakers can take note of research on multiculturalism and how this can shape and inform policy and drive change. So I'm looking forward to hearing what both of you have to say in the headline act of today's session in the History Festival. As with the previous session, we'll have both the papers first and then we'll begin the discussion. So if you do have any questions, if you could hold them off until both speakers have finished their papers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for having me, everyone. What I'm going to talk to you today, or talk about today, is a hidden history of empire and about the disconnect that can exist between public representations of the past, as embodied by things like statues, and the histories that are researched by and written about by professional historians. And my starting point is the recent culture wars and the global movement to topple contentious statues like that of the controversial slaver Edward Colston in Bristol, which was tossed into Bristol Harbour by anti-racist activists in June 2020. Colston's toppling offered us a stark reminder that historical statues represent a particular version of the past and past memories, and ones that, by and large, reflect and represent the ideas and interests of those who put them up. So in the case of Colston, his statue had been built in 1895 to celebrate his philanthropy. But this obviously conveniently ignored his role in organising and profiting from the Atlantic slave trade. So statues and memorials thus play a role in concealing as much as revealing the past. And this has implications for public understandings of both the past and the present. In another less well-known example, take the Lendi Memorial, pictured here, which was also erected in 1895. This memorial is known locally and affectionately as the Lendi Lion. And it's situated in Sunbury Memorial Gardens, not far from here in the borough of Spelthorne. This memorial also became engulfed in public controversy following the toppling of the Colston statue, when a wave of debates ensued across Britain about the moral and political rights and wrongs of maintaining statues and monuments in Britain's public spaces. And a prominent protagonist in these debates was, Topple the Racists, who launched a website mapping over 60 monuments and statues around Britain that were deemed to have links to colonial violence. And the Lendi Memorial is one of the memorials that's on this list. According to the inscription on the Lendi Memorial, the Lendi lion honours two brothers, both from Sunbury, Captain Charles Lendy and Captain Edward Lendy, both of whom were British soldiers who lost their lives in service of the expansion of the British Empire in Africa. Charles in territories that became Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and Edward in Sierra Leone. The brothers died in 1894 and 1893, respectively. This memorial was funded by friends, family, and the British military as a tribute to the memory of two brave men. Indeed, the memorial inscription praises the indefatigable zeal and conspicuous bravery of Charles Lendy on behalf of his country. Sentiments that are echoed in the imagery of the lion sitting proud over the memorial die. However, Topple the racists contest this set-in-stone version of the Lendy brothers' past actions in southern and western Africa. Topple the racists instead claim that Lendi Lion is, quote, a memorial to remember two colonizing brothers, both responsible for murdering African tribes with machine guns. As with the identification of other statues and memorials by Topple the racists, the inclusion of the Lendi Lion on the website instigated a wave of local public debate about the place and meaning of this statue in Sunbury. A local petition was launched to #SaveLendy, and the local council commissioned research into the memorial and the provenance of the memorial and of the Lendi brothers. At first, the council insisted on having research into this memorial conducted by professional historians, but they later reversed their decision, and a local resident and a former chairman of the local resident society was invited to produce a public information booklet. And this booklet now lays in the public domain. This public information booklet is nonetheless problematic, and it's problematic for a number of reasons. First of all, it aligns very closely to the agenda of the #SaveLendy campaign, which quickly dismissed the accusations by Topple the racists as being incorrect and slanderous. Second, this booklet rather uncritically echoes the sentiments and rhetoric of those who put the memorial up in the late 19th century. The Lendi brothers and the British Imperial Project that they were involved with are praised for their heroism and for their bravery. Third, and most problematically, the booklet contains serious historical inaccuracies. Take Charles Lendy, presented to us by the memorial and in the public information booklet as a colonial hero. What the historical record actually tells us is that he was a colonial murderer. We know this because we have his confessional document. It lies in the British National Archives here in London. On 17th March 1892, Charles Lendy murdered a Shona chief called Ngomo, alongside Ngomo's son and 19 others in the hinterland of what is now Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe. Charles Lendy surrounded Ngomo's village and without warning opened fire. In his confessional document, Lendy shows very little remorse for the loss of life he inflicted, describing it as necessary for the enforcement of law and order. Ngomo's crime was being accused of the theft of some goods from a local white farm. At the time of the murder, Lendy was no hero. His actions were actually roundly condemned. by the colonial authorities in southern Africa, by government officials here in London, and by MPs in Parliament and in the British press. For example, in a very widely reported Commons debate on 19th September 1893, Lendy was accused of a shameful act of butchery, a wanton attack, the slaughter of Shona. And MPs called on Lendy to return to Britain to face trial for murder. Given these facts, how come a statue was erected honouring Charles Lendy just 2 years later in 1895? And how come the people of Spelthorne have been led to believe that he is a colonial hero? The answer to these questions lies actually in the politics of late 19th century imperial expansion. As Britain expanded its colonial possessions in Africa during the 1880s and 1890s, there was no consensus on the rights and wrongs of empire building. Indeed, Lendy's murder of Ngomo seemed to confirm to what many critics of imperial expansion believed, which was that it was a project of self-interested capitalists who cared little about the treatment of so-called native populations. The imperial project was thought by these critics to be characterized by race pride, by chauvinism, and the glorification of war. On the other side of the debate were those who wished for the British to project a strong image of empire for strategic and economic reasons, and they supported the expansion of British possessions by chartered companies like the British South Africa Company, Charles Lendy's employers in southern Africa, who were engaged in a process of expanding British influence there. In 1893, when Ngomo was murdered by Charles Lendy, the reaction here in Britain tells us that this debate was still raging. And at the time, Lendy's only real defenders were employees of the British South Africa Company or other members of white settler society in southern Africa. But by 1895, when this statue is erected, so just by 2 years later, the debate had shifted. And it was the imperialists like Lendy and the British South Africa Company who appeared to have won the argument. For all the denunciation by British government officials, by politicians, and the British press over Ngomo's murder, by the mid-1890s, an older age of imperialism and free trade had given way to a more aggressive alternative. For instance, in 1895, Lord Salisbury led the Conservatives to power in Westminster, and the imperialist Joseph Chamberlain became Secretary of State for the colonies. Defending British imperialism in 1897, Chamberlain was unequivocal. You cannot have omelettes without breaking eggs. In making this argument, Chamberlain normalised the violence and brutality of British imperialism that Ngomo's murder represented as a routine part of the imperial civilizing mission. So the Lendi Memorial, erected at this pivotal moment in British imperial history, serves as a piece of imperial propaganda. It was paid for by donations from other British servicemen and adorned with the British lion. The memorial signifies courage, heroism, and the role of the military in the expansion of Britain's empire. But this both concealed the violence and brutality that lay behind Britain's empire and served as part of a process of legitimising a particular way of doing empire that was deeply contested. Of course, there is nothing of this history in the public information booklet produced on behalf of Spelthorne Council. In fact, by reading through draft versions of the current booklet, we know that crucial aspects of this history, including Lendy's role in Ngomo's murder, as well as the public response to it at the time, have been deliberately censored. So where does this leave the residents of Spelthorne, many of whom have also asked for the truth about the memorial to be told? Interestingly, a few days after Colston's statue was toppled in Bristol, Prime Minister Boris Johnson issued a statement on Twitter. "We cannot now try to edit or censor up our past," he said. "We cannot pretend to have a different history. Removing statues," he argued, "would be to lie about our history and impoverish the education of generations to come." His thoughts are actually echoed by online comments on the Lower Sunbury Residents Association website, as well as on the hashtag Save Lendy petition website. Spelthorne Council has also documented a range of online comments from Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, which also reflect this desire among the local Spelthorne community to have the full facts of history told. But the Spelthorne Council booklet has rewritten history, not through a process of careful, thorough, impartial academic revision in the light of new evidence or disciplinary frameworks, as is part of the discipline of history, but by deliberately distorting evidence and eliminating a known historical event from a public narrative about Britain's past. Why Spelthorne Borough Council and the authors of the public information booklet seem determined to maintain a myth about Charles Lendy and his reputation has yet to be fully explained. So while it's certainly true that confrontations between past or colonial past and present, ignited by Topple the Racists and others, has forced a reckoning with many statues and memorials, as with the Colston statue, it's actually the enduring power of late 19th century narratives about Charles Lendy that are represented in the Lendi Memorial that lay behind much of the recent debate over the Lendi lion. Indeed, Lendy's present-day defenders have revived late 19th century talk about his heroism and bravery, and in doing so, they echo colonial-era rhetoric and tropes about the civilizing mission and the supposed benefits of British imperialism. Ultimately, the controversy over the Lendi Memorial was never really about establishing the full and impartial historical facts about the accusations levelled against the Lendi brothers, and Charles Lendy in particular. Instead, it was about reinforcing a version of the past that serves and aligns with local public and political agendas. Had it been otherwise, as Spelthorne initially maintained, then the council would have engaged properly qualified historians to conduct and complete the inquiry. Instead, known historical facts have been removed from the public domain. So what I hope this example also shows is the importance, necessity even, of the role of history in current public debates and campaigns about controversial statues.
So first I'd like to begin by thanking Alison for organising this day and this session, which for me, this session sort of marks what I sometimes call the historical turn in studying multiculturalism. You see, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even early 90s, sociologists studied multiculturalism, some anthropologists, inspired by the late Michael Banton, studied the subject. Political theorists got in on the action. But in and around the late 90s, historians began to think seriously about this phenomenon that we've come to call multiculturalism. And so emerged important individual case histories of policies of multiculturalism, people who studied the British policy of multiculturalism, the Canadian, the Australian one. Then came comparative studies. Then came quite serious work on the history of political theories of multiculturalism. But actually very little as yet has been said about the history of the term multiculturalism itself. Terms denote ideas. They connect us to bodies of thought. Where does this idea come from? I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about that. Now, there are obviously important historical precedents. Emperor Ashoka and Akbar in India have inspired the important work of Rajiv Bhargava and others on multiculturalism. The medieval idea of communitas communitatum inspired the English pluralists who sought to retain the autonomy of the English church. But the idea of multiculturalism first becomes visible in a tangible form that we actually refer to using this word in the 1950s in the prairies in Canada. People were referring to a multicultural society. It seemed to make sense of the world around them. Come the 1960s, this description of Canada becomes more political. In a context in which many people are referring to Canada as either a Britain of the North, a bilingual and bicultural country. A great many Ukrainian Canadians, Italian Canadians, Polish Canadians are saying, hold on a minute, Canada is not monocultural, it's not bicultural, it's multicultural, it has to include people like us. They were offering an alternative conception of their country, an inclusive conception of it, one that could appeal to all Canadians, not just some. Come the 1970s, people begin to talk about policies of multiculturalism, policies that promote this idea of a country, an inclusive idea of a country, policies that promote race equality, policies that promote exemptions for minority religious practices. And then in the 1980s, we have political theories of multiculturalism. These political theories offer a vision of what a multicultural society can become, a vision of what it can become if its citizens accept multicultural conceptions of themselves, if its citizens use these policies of multiculturalism to become more egalitarian. And now notice that 4 common uses of the term multiculturalism emerge. A sociological descriptive idea of a multicultural society, a multicultural conception of a polity to compete with more exclusive ideas, policies, and then political theories of multiculturalism. They operate at different levels of abstraction. The first, a multicultural society, describes what's going on the ground. The last operates as a vision for us to aspire to. And what we have here is the emergence from the 1950s onwards of a tradition of political thought. Political thought occurs at different levels of abstraction. It might occur at the most basic level of a citizen and how they're deciding to vote. It might occur at a governmental level of policies that they're deciding to introduce. And it might occur at the most abstract level of a political philosopher trying to paint a vision of what we should aspire to. And this tradition has become criticized. In fact, many people say it is no more. It has buckled under criticisms of it being divisive, entails essentialism, that it's bad for women, it ignores intersectionality, it ignores racism. These are just some examples. But all of these examples, in truth, have been shown to be actually false, exaggerated. This is not me defending these ideas, because through this contestation, different ideas about a multicultural society, about policies of multiculturalism, have become more defensible. This contestation has actually been crucial. Likewise, since 9/11, multiculturalism is said to be dead. in retreat, gone. And many people saw Brexit as a sign of that too. But actually, if we just focus on those 4 levels that I talked about before, critics accept a multicultural society where once they did not. Very few people are willing to stand up publicly and say now, oh, actually, just don't like a multicultural society. I don't like this idea. In the 1980s, this happened a lot. Roger Scruton published big articles about the problems with the thought of a multicultural society. There's great survey evidence now that shows that most people would endorse some kind of inclusive multicultural conception of their polity in different countries. Policies have proliferated that are about multiculturalism, as have political theories of multiculturalism. This tradition seems to still be with us, despite many people saying it is not. And it contains some ideas that are of use. It contains resources that we can use. Take for a minute just what Hana was talking about. She was talking about statues, controversial monuments. There are a great many after the toppling of Colston, and in Canada with the toppling of the statue at Ryerson, the toppling of Confederate statues in the US and elsewhere, who have talked about public space reflecting a majority. And many scholars say, oh, actually, what we need now is a debate about these statues, a dialogue. And that's fine. But what exactly should this dialogue focus on? If it should focus on just these statues, then we're missing something that various multiculturalists have pointed out. That these statues are a subject of debate because they offend against certain contemporary norms, values, and beliefs that many, including a majority, believe in. If, for example, most members of a cultural majority believe in the equal worth of all human beings, well, how can they have statues of slave traders? If the majority believe that all citizens should have the same legal and political status, and this is why they're entitled to the same rights, equal treatment, the same number of votes, why they're all equally subject to the law, if they believe that all citizens should have the same legal and political status, then how can public space reflect only a majority? A number of things are going on here with what multiculturalists are talking about in the dialogue. They're forcing a majority to take seriously their own norms, values, and beliefs. In doing so, if a minority adopts this form of activism, they're insulating themselves against criticisms that they're imposing their beliefs on what they want on a majority. They're forcing also a majority to live up to their finest tendencies in thought and behavior. And they're asking them that these finest tendencies in thought and behavior be dominant. In doing so, public space no longer just reflects the majority, it reflects the majority's finest tendencies in thought and behavior. And it reflects the needs of minorities too. This way of thinking about the dialogue as appealing to the majority's finest tendencies comes from what various multiculturalists have been developing, a dialogical theory of multiculturalism, for the last 30-odd years. Buried within this tradition of thought that has began to become first visible in the 1950s are a series of ideas that can help to resolve a number of contemporary dilemmas. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you to both of you. I've taking loads and loads of notes and I've learned a lot just thinking about them. I'm kind of still mulling things over about change over time and about the different national contexts and then the connection between the local and the global that Inga talked about. One of But what I would like to start our discussion by thinking about, I was thinking about what Varun said about the criticisms of multiculturalism and then their end and what happens with that. And I was thinking about the ways that talking about multiculturalism and also talking about empire are ways of talking about race, but without using the word race. Well, or they can be, or using the word ethnicity, and without saying so. And both of you, as you're talking about criticisms of these terms and of this past and the way that they have changed and adopted different forms, are talking about kind of shifting views towards not just the terms that you're talking about, but also race and ethnicity. So I'd be really interested to hear some of your thoughts about kind of how this criticism, what the end of this criticism means. Has it moved on to other things? So are people no longer criticising multiculturalism because they've moved on to talking about empire instead? And so the connections between the two topics that you were talking about. Sorry, my question's really ill-formed. It's been a long day.
I can start if you want to. Do you want to collect your thoughts?
Yeah.
Okay. So, a great many people have argued, and mostly with a particular prominent political theorist of multiculturalism in mind, that multiculturalism is racially illiterate, does not focus on empire, does not focus on racial inequalities. To be honest with you, people who say such things, I often feel like giving them one of my student reading lists. I don't, right, because I think that's very offensive. But a number of facts begin to emerge first. Step one, multiculturalists who are also visible minorities have never ignored the matter of race or empire. A lot of their work comes out of post-colonial Marxist movements. People like Bhikkhu Parekh were writing about post-colonialism when very few people were writing about post-colonialism, and he's perhaps one of Britain's most famous British multiculturalists. Second, their ideas are deeply invested in post-colonial ideas. Their deep studies of Gandhi and Tagore's thought, how they rejected empire, what it meant for the British to be rejected in this way. I mean, you see this throughout their work. You literally just need to open books, and you can see it suffused in their work. Okay. Second, race. Now, of course, look, race is a highly contested term. There are different schools of thought that examine whether or not there should be a biological conception of race, and if there shouldn't, how can you have ideas of racism? All of those debates exist. But what multiculturalists have tried to do most is try to talk about what it takes to produce an egalitarian culture in which racism is unacceptable in its subtle and implicit forms, as well as its most explicit and vulgar forms. For like it or not, those of us who are interested in combating racism have to generate some kind of cultural change. If culture is the beliefs and practices that regulate our lives, that inform our decision-making processes, the way in which we interact, those need to change if we are going to create a more egalitarian society in which people are less prone to racism or suffer from it. Combating racism is primarily a cultural activity, although it's not badged as such. But secondly, for those of us who have been writing about Islamophobia now for maybe 15 or so years, we've decided to deliberately badge it as a form of racism. In short, the conversation may have moved directly to empire and racism, as it should. There's nothing wrong with that. But multiculturalists have been doing it for years, and other people are just catching up with them in some ways instead, and that reverses the thrust of the question. I'll stop there.
So I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of the presentation I gave, and to put bluntly, I think part of the reason why the public reaction to the kind of naming and shaming of the Lendi Memorial was quite extreme. No one actually ever called for the Lendi lion to be pulled down. All that was ever called for was that more information be given to the local community about the statue. But there was a very sort of extreme reaction to that among certain sections of the local community, which, that felt under attack by the desire to know more about this statue. And this is why the Save Lendy campaign was begun, was to protect the Lendi Memorial from being toppled, as had happened to Colston. And I think, part of the research that I would like to do in the future is to investigate these issues a little bit more. But what happened was that people felt like their sensibilities were under attack through the attack against the memorial. What people thought they knew about Britain's empire was being undermined, it was being challenged. And there was the reaction to that was to defend a narrative about Britain's empire that they had grown up with, that they believed in deeply. And I think that it happened to coincide with broader societal debates about the place of Britain in the world. This happened, just after Brexit. The Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister, ideas about global Britain, and this all comes together, and people sort of feel like the idea of a resurgent Britain is under attack, and that's what has led to, in part, this feeling that people want to defend the Lendi Memorial and defend the British Empire. I haven't said anything about race. I think for some people, implicit within that is, unfortunately, underlying sentiments of racism, that Britain has this imperial past, and that is based on the fact that, based on kind of ideas about race and racism. But what I found very interesting is just the way that people like Topple the Racists, who are trying to challenge some of the public general public understandings about the empire, the very defensive reaction that has created among certain groups in society. Yeah.
Do we have any questions from the audience? There's a microphone coming for you.
Hi, I have two questions. First of all, I wanted to thank you for your presentations. I really learned a lot. Thank you, I appreciate it. But first of all, I always wanted to know how we can make sure we are on the right path. I mean, because if, for example, the statue point of view, if we are going to choose our path, are we going with the British Empire or are we going with the African ones? So which one is the right one then? Because everyone are going by their values and the values are going to show their paths. But how we make sure it's the right one? That's one of the questions. And the next one is how we can make sure we're not forcing our beliefs into the path when we are the leaders. Because when we are opening a path and we are starting a journey, we are acting as leaders, and especially right now our PhD students, and we are having plan for future. So how we are make sure we are not going to force our ideas into our followers' ideas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, good questions. So one of the things I should have said at the beginning that the work that I've been doing on the Lendi Memorial is a collaboration between myself and Inga, who spoke earlier in the day. And one of the things we were very clear about at the start when we first got involved in this project of looking at the Lendi Memorial, that was we're both very clear in ourselves that we don't have a particular position on whether, or we haven't approached this from a position of we are for or against memorials to empire in Britain's public spaces. The research that I and Inga have been doing hasn't come from a particular position on that. I think what we felt was, and full disclosure, myself and Inga were the historians that were first approached to investigate this by Spelthorne Council. And we had no idea about, I didn't know it existed until Spelthorne got in touch. But what has guided us is a sense that, a wanting to tell the truth, and a very strong feeling that the truth was being deliberately covered up, which it was in this case. And it's not that Inga and myself wanted to particularly, put forward a particularly critical perspective on Britain's empire, or that we wanted to put forward a apologetic perspective on empire. But what we wanted to do was to reveal the facts and to find out who was right. Was it #Save Lendy? Was it Topple the Racists? What's come out of that is a very critical perspective. But we didn't go into this with that kind of that as being the agenda, to write a critical or to have a critical perspective. But yes, I don't quite know where I'm going with this exactly. But I think, yes, you're absolutely right. It is important, we all tell stories in our own ways and with our own, personal biases and agendas. But I think what is very clear in the case of the Lendi Memorial is that it's not just, it's that a incorrect version of the past is being presented to a local community who asked for the truth. And that is, in my mind, a problem.
Thank you for your answer. I just think I wasn't clear enough. I do understand, well, as a researcher, you shouldn't put your own personal ideas into your research. But what I mean is the next step, like as leaders, how you can define the right or the wrong. And I wanted to know from your perspective, because you have done this research. And so, thank you.
I'm not sure that it's a question of being right or wrong. In this particular case, it was about establishing the historical facts and the historical context, understanding what actually happened in terms of what Charles Lendy did, and then the context and how he became memorialized. So it's not that it was about sort of, being right or wrong. It was about revealing historical facts. I'm not sure quite if I'm explaining that right.
I was just thinking that Varun might have some thoughts on kind of where you go next, like what the potential of academic research is in terms of shaping debates or shaping policy, or like what happens next, Varun?
So I'd make 3 points. The first indirectly relating to your two questions, and the second and third more directly. So the first point is that Hannah's absolutely right in that there is at some level, what historians are doing is trying to recover and reconstruct what has happened. And the truth should speak, and should be in some senses enough. But there's also then, in addition to that, a situation whereby you have to know what will guide how we should approach things when it isn't enough. When, for example, people want to believe falsehoods, or when actually the truth is quite discomforting, other things might hang on sort of accepting some things that might be difficult to accept. And I think that's where your two questions begin to emerge. So question number one, how do you know you're on the right path? Well, this is in the realm of political theory. Since Plato, political philosophers have painted visions of the type of society we should seek. Or like an artist will paint a vision. In a similar way, a philosopher will try with minute detail to try to depict the type of society we should strive for. And the quality of their arguments is everything, right? But that guides us, because if we know what type of society we're seeking, then we know whether or not an action is a step towards that society or a step away from it, right? But that's not to say that everyone should be political theorists or anything. I mean, heaven forbid if that happened. People like me would be out of a job as well. But it has a purpose, as it were. How do you avoid, however, enforcing your vision on others who might disagree? This is where the dialogue I talked about came in. People like me are committed to, and some, for example, radicals would say we're far too tepid, but we're committed to the importance of dialogue and convincing other people that they must alter their behavior in certain ways. They must alter a practice. Now that, again, is all about the quality of the argument. But it's about the quality of the argument that doesn't beat the other person over the head with, here are 25 reasons why you're wrong. I could come up with them. But it's an attempt to appeal to their heart as well as their mind, right? Their better instincts, as I talked about, their better tendencies in thought and behavior. And that's where activating, as I talked about, the majority's finer tendencies in thought and behavior, to show actually these sorts of statues, unless explained or removed, are inconsistent with their own fine tendencies in thought and behavior, encouraging them to live up to those standards, pluralizing in the process the way they interpret and relate their own beliefs and practices so as to include people like me. I think that sort of dialogue is crucial. And you strive in that dialogue to point towards the broader vision that you've painted of what society should become. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, completely.
Okay.
We have time for one last question.
I was at a talk given by Lord Perec a few years ago, and he spoke about the time when he was discussing with government what forms multiculturalism should take in Britain and how multiculturalism should appear. And one of the main questions was which aspects of other cultures were acceptable within multicultural Britain, and which things from other cultures, well, we just couldn't actually accept here. So what it turned into was really a discussion of monoculture, those aspects of the other culture which were acceptable to Britain and which were not. So I'm just wondering from that perspective how far we've moved towards true multiculturalism and how much what has happened has been a sort of assimilative monoculture.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's a good question, and I should reveal an interest here. Before I became an academic, I worked in government, and I first met Bhikkhu Parekh in the context of those conversations. I was part of leading the response to the Parekh report. And he's absolutely right. That was the structure of the conversation back then. Which beliefs and practices of minorities can we accept? Not forced marriage, no, terrible. Not female genital mutilation, my God, what kind of society would we be? So much is obvious. Very few minorities, particularly of my generation, would defend many of those practices. But what's interesting is how we've reversed that conversation over the last 20 years. Now we're asking, which beliefs and practices of the majority should we keep? Can we really defend statues of slave traders today? And can we really say that Rhodes should remain where he does? That conversation is not just happening in this country. It's happening in Belgium, the Netherlands, South Africa, India. Reversing the structure of that majority-minority dynamic. Saying, is this really the case? Is it only minorities that have morally problematic practices? If, as I said before, we really all do believe that all humans have equal worth, if we really believe that, how can we celebrate a statue of a slave trader? And if we're saying it serves an educational purpose, fine, it can do so in a museum. Or it can be explained. That isn't a reason to leave as is. The debate, in my opinion, has shifted. Even as multiculturalism has become something that, a taboo word in some ways, the dynamic has changed, however, in that we're now discussing, as we were not doing 20 years ago, which of the majority's practices can we really keep? Is it really the case that we can keep such statues and monuments? I think many people might wonder whether that's the case, and how we would defend really doing so. Certainly the Prime Minister hasn't got a very good response. We can't deny our history. No one's saying we should. All we're saying is, if it's history, it should appear in history books, it should be explained, or it should be taken down. Let's have a debate about it. Let's not call it culture wars, because that's far too violent and oppositional, but let's have the dialogue. And that dialogue has changed over 20 years. That's my impression of how things have changed. I hope that answers your question.
Anna, did you want to add to that?
All I was going to say is I think what Varun just said much more eloquently explained the backlash to the Lendi Memorial, right? Here is a statue that is supposed to represent, Britain's cultural heritage from a majority perspective, and it is being questioned in a way that it hasn't been questioned previously. And yeah, as I say, that's upsetting people's sensibilities, their sense of their identity, in ways that haven't happened previously. And I think that is part of what is being worked through in these statue wars, culture wars, whatever you want to call it, at the moment.
Thank you. And actually, that's quite a fitting final point and final 2 points, because the inspiration for today was actually kind of conversations that we were having as historians around the toppling of statues and around the place of empire in debates, then which led on to broader conversations about the way that history is used and misused, whether it's Vladimir Putin, whether it was the leaked draft opinion from the US Supreme Court a couple of weeks ago, whether it was the French presidential election campaign with Eric Zemmour's comments, that history has a potency and it has a purchase in the present. And so that was what we wanted to do today, was to bring people together who have different perspectives and have researched in different areas, and to share their thoughts and to have conversations about the power that history has, how those ideas about what the past is, and especially ideas about progress, and people in the past had different values, as Boris Johnson said, but we'll leave the statues there, and that will teach us about our history. Because, of course, as Varun says, you can't learn about history from a statue of a slave trader. So I think it's been really successful in doing that. I think it's been a wonderful day of people being very generous with their time and being very generous with their research and sharing it, and also with the audience being wonderfully kind of receptive to this and coming up with some fabulous questions. So thank you to the panelists, but also thank you to you as an audience. It's been a really, really wonderful day. So thank you to everyone for your participation.